Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wallace Collection Online, and welcome to today's Meet the Expert talk, Frans Hals, the Male Portrait, with Dr. Lelia Packer, our curator of Dutch, Italian, Spanish, German, and pre-1600 paintings here at the Wallace Collection. I'll be handing over to Lelia in just a few minutes' time, but as always, before we do, just a few bits of housekeeping to get us started. So firstly, if you're having any difficulties at home, do just drop us a message either via the chat or Q&A on Zoom or the comments or chat on YouTube. This would also be the right place to send in your questions and comments. So do get those in throughout today's talk, again, either via the chat, Q&A, or the comment section on YouTube. And I'll be putting those to Lelia a little later on. Secondly, just to say that if you're joining us on Zoom, you can choose to have live captions. If you just select that at the bottom of your screen, there should be an option for that there. And if you're joining from YouTube, you should receive live captions as standard. Finally, today's talk will be recorded, so don't worry if you miss anything. It'll all be up on our YouTube channel to view afterwards. So with all of that business out the way, please allow me to hand over to Lelia for today's talk. Over to you. Oh, sorry, Lelia, I think you're on mute there.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ollie, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for a sort of introduction to our current exhibition, Frans Hals, the Male Portrait, at the Wallace Collection. This exhibition, which I've been fortunate enough to be able to curate in a rather, difficult period during the pandemic, COVID times, miraculously, all of our loans have arrived, the exhibition opened, and I am in the position to be able to walk you through the exhibition virtually today. So I feel very fortunate to have been able to put on this exhibition during particularly challenging times. So the exhibition opened on the 22nd of September and will run through the 30th of January. So if you haven't visited already, please do so if you're able to, if you happen to be in London. Otherwise, there's a lot happening on our website, and I will direct you to that content a bit later on in the presentation. But what I thought I'd do this afternoon is take you through some of the thoughts that we had behind the ideas behind the exhibition, what we're trying to achieve, and then take you through the actual pictures in the exhibition and the points we're trying to make with the particular portraits that we've selected. So this is basically our first major international loans exhibition at the Wallace Collection. We're very proud we have loans from North America, across Europe, and this country. And we thought, what better work of art to organize our first major loan exhibition around, but our very own Laughing Cavalier, the very iconic portrait by Frans Hals, which we're very fortunate to have in our own collection. So sorry, I'll just take you. So what I wanted to do just very briefly is tell you the ideas behind the exhibition, the sort of aims of the exhibition. So of course, you know that Frans Hals, together with Rembrandt and Vermeer, is one of the greatest masters of the Dutch Golden Age. But unlike Rembrandt, for example, he doesn't have 10 exhibitions a year. In fact, the last exhibition on Frans Hals in this country was in 1990, over 3 decades ago. So we thought, not only do we want to showcase our Laughing Cavalier, but we want to put Frans Hals back on the map, shall we say, among the great masters of the Dutch Golden Age. In fact, 17th century Dutch contemporaries praised Frans Hals for his ability to make his portraits. They said his portraits seem to live and breathe. And that seems to be particularly, that sense of being vivid and this vitality seems to be particularly pertinent to his portraits of men in particular. That sense of animated presence that contemporaries commented on. So what our exhibition does is it brings together a very carefully selected group of 13 of what we consider to be Frans Hals's best male portraits, independent individual male portraits. And from across his long career, he began his career in 1610 and he he painted all the way through the end of his life in 1666. He painted for quite a long time. So we have pictures that span his long career. And in doing so, the exhibition situates for the first time Frans Hals's most iconic painting, The Laughing Cavalier, within the context of the artist's larger oeuvre. It also explores how through pose, how through fashion, painting technique, Hals transformed the male portrait into something entirely new and fresh, capturing and revealing his sitter's characters like no one else before him. And each and every single portrait tells its own story, whether that is about the time in which it was painted, about the context, about that particular individual. Some we know more about, others we know less about. They each tell different stories. And so I'd like to take you through some of those stories this afternoon. This is a print of the city of Haarlem, where Frans Hals lived and worked, and it appears in the first room of the exhibition. I'll show you that in just a moment. But just to situate you in the city of Haarlem, because Hals's portraiture is intimately bound up with the port city of Haarlem, in which he lived for the majority of his life. His family arrives there when he's 3 from Antwerp. And as far as we know, he only left the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic at that time, once in 1616 for a visit back to Antwerp, his native city. And this is a print made around the same time as our Laughing Cavalier, so in 1628, and you can see the city from the south, the River Sparne, going up towards the center of the city. Frans Hals's patrons were predominantly from Haarlem's elite. They were members of the militia, burgomasters, many wealthy merchants and tradesmen. Now, brewing and the cloth industry were the major areas of commercial production in the city of Haarlem, and you'll see we're going to come across several brewers and textile merchants as we meet the portraits that have arrived to us here at the Wallace. Haarlem also saw an exodus of Flemish migrants coming to Haarlem in the late 16th century, and a lot of the men in our exhibition are indeed have Flemish ancestry or are themselves Flemish. And as I said, Frans Hals's own family moved from Antwerp in the late 16th century. By 1610, when Frans Hals comes onto the artistic scene, Haarlem is a vibrant cosmopolitan center, as well as an artistic center at this time, particularly when it comes to printmaking. But Frans Hals doesn't really have any great competition in the portrait genre, and it's really here that he thrives, that he's able to really excel, and he really creates a niche for himself as a portraitist. And this is what he does mostly, is portraits, aside from some genre scenes during the 1620s and 1630s. And as I say, he paints all kinds of portraits of men, portraits of women, group portraits, family portraits. We, of course, had to be very selective in our choice and really focus on the male portraits to be as relevant as we could possibly be for our own picture, The Laughing Cavalier. So we wanted to reunite it with pictures like it and really put it in a very focused context. This is a copy after a thought to be self-portrait of Frans Hals. So this is what we think he looked like. And just to give you a little bit about his biography, as I say, he mostly worked as a portraitist. And sadly, despite having a very long and successful career, he fell out of fashion after he died in 1666 and was long forgotten, fell into complete obscurity until the late 19th century. He was accused of dissolute living. He was criticized for his lack of finish by many, including artists like Reynolds, for example. He was married twice and had 12 children, so quite a large family. And he lived in several rented accommodation in the city of Haarlem throughout his life, was in debt quite a bit. And so this might be why he was accused of this kind of dissolute living. We know that he was sued by his butcher, his baker, and his shoemaker for various unpaid debts. But as I say, his reputation was revived in the late 19th century. And I think the sale of the Laughing Cavalier in 1865 played a primordial role in this revival. The fourth Marquis of Hertford, one of our main founders here at the Wallace collection, paid a phenomenal sum for the Laughing Cavalier, which broke all records at the time and really helped reestablish Frans Hals's reputation. Frans Hals was subsequently greatly admired by Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, who really considered him their precursor. Okay, so this is the first room of the exhibition, and in here we have a blow-up of this print I just showed you, as well as one of Frans Hals's earliest portrait, this portrait of a man with a skull from the Barber Institute of Fine Arts, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So we're sort of in the introductory room, we're setting the scene and introducing visitors to Frans Hals, to his city, and to his earliest work. And then we move through into the main room of the exhibition, which is, we've left it as one big open room, as you can see, and all of the remaining 12 portraits are hung together in this way, as if they're sort of seated around a grand dinner table with our Laughing Cavalier at the head of the table. And I very carefully selected which pictures were going to be next around, as you would in a seating chart, I suppose, at a fancy dinner. You want to make sure that those seated right next to we got that very right. So it took a long time to decide who was going to sit next to him, and I'll explain some of those choices in a moment. And then the hang is roughly chronological, and we move towards the other side of the room, towards the very latest portrait from the Fitzwilliam Museum at the other end of the room. So you can sort of take your time, and you can see the portraits are hung parallel in sort of pairs, I suppose, and it really gives you the sense that they are engaging with one another, that they're interacting with both us and each other, and hopefully there's a lot of conversation going on, visual as well as from our visitors, amongst our visitors. And then I just wanted to point out, we've spent a great deal of time on our multimedia guide and thought a great deal about how to bring these portraits to life. And what we decided to do is offer a multitude of voices that tell us different aspects about these portraits. So for example, for the Laughing Cavalier, for each portrait, I give a sort of introduction to each of the portraits and as you would in a curator-led tour. And then we have different experts that tell us something specific about that portrait from a variety of disciplines. So for example, for the Laughing Cavalier, we've asked our curator of arms and armor, Toby Capwell, to talk about the very sumptuous rapier that our Laughing Cavalier carries. We have paintings conservator Nicole Ryder talking about Frans Hals's technique as it pertains to the Laughing Cavalier. And then for most of the paintings, we have Grayson Perry, contemporary artist, giving his take on the pictures as an artist who is very much interested in masculinity and how masculinity is conceived and portrayed. And so he has a very interesting take on each and every one of the portraits. I'll just give you another example. For Peter Fondambrica, we have one of the history curators from the Rijksmuseum who recently curated the slavery exhibition, giving us a little bit, actually quite a fascinating story about Peter Fondambrica and his involvement with the early years of the Dutch slave trade. Oscar Helderblom is a economics historian at the University of Utrecht, and he tells us about the Dutch East India Company. And of course, Peter Fondambrica was an admiral in that Dutch East India Company, and again, Grayson Perry. So if you do visit the exhibition, I do really encourage you to take the multimedia guide, because I think it really does bring these portraits to life and really engages us. And you might find someone, you don't have to do all of them. You can choose and pick and decide how you want to use the guide, and it allows this sort of flexible visitor engagement. So that's the multimedia guide. And then the exhibition is also accompanied by a catalogue, which goes very much in depth on our Laughing Cavalier, as well as on the other portraits in the exhibition. Right, so now I wanted to take you through the different portraits in the exhibition and look at greater depth at each one of them. There's only one. Is not because he's any less sort of interesting and achieved as the others, but I suppose to say that Frans Hals had relatively conventional beginnings as a portraitist. He is painting in a way that you might expect a portraitist to do at that time. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. And just very quickly after that, he really begins to experiment and with pose, with the way in which he paints, with technique, painterly technique, with the way he poses his sitters within the composition, and then departs from the conventions that you might expect from portraits from that period. So what I mean by relatively conventional beginnings is that, you know, this sitter, he is posed relatively stiffly. You don't get a sense of movement from him. You don't get a sense that he's being captured in a fleeting moment. He's posed relatively stiffly. He's wearing rather conservative clothing, as you would expect of individuals from that time, Spanish influenced garments. You can see that he's wearing black, relatively sober, with this very stiffly starched collar, which we will see the evolution of menswear will very much lead to flattened collars, and more colorful clothing for those who want to adhere to those fashions. So his clothing is relatively sober. He also has these attributes like the skull, which Frans Hals very soon will omit from his formal portraits. The skull being, of course, an allusion to the brevity of human life. And, you know, although 60 nowadays is no longer a ripe old age, it was in Frans Hals's time, so he would have had death on his mind, and so that is something that is certainly being suggested by the skull, which he holds very much like a second portrait. It's almost like we're seeing two versions of himself. He is turning and he is gesturing towards the right, where he would have hung the pendant portrait or companion portrait of his wife, who is today at Chatsworth House. And just to say that at this moment in Dutch portraits, conventionally the man would have been on the left and the woman would have been on the right. The woman would have been positioned on the man's sinister or on the man's left or sinister or lesser side. And the man would have been on the dexter side if you're facing from their orientation, if you see what I mean. But you can see that they're starting to turn towards one another, although they're still very much looking out at us. And in time, Frans Hals engages companion portraits much more so than in this early instance. Nevertheless, you know, he is painting rather swiftly. If we look at the cuffs, there are these Frans Hals characteristics, and his signature style is still very much visible even in this very early portrait. These very rosy cheeks, the fleshiness of the skin, you very much still feel it at this early moment. And then the next portrait that we get to chronologically is the Laughing Cavalier, which is a relatively early work, I suppose, because, you know, Frans Hals paints all the way until 1666, and this portrait was painted in 1624. So it's I suppose one of his greatest works, painted at a relatively early point in his artistic career. So the man portrait, we know that he's 26 years old from the inscription at the top. We know the portrait was painted in 1624, again from the inscription. It is very much an iconic painting, and in the book we examine what makes it iconic, what makes a picture really stand out to achieve this kind of status where it's being reproduced countlessly on in various ways. It's been hailed as the Dutch Mona Lisa, and it really never fails to impress and delight on any visit to the Wallace collection. He stands out in his lively immediacy, in the directness with which he engages us, and in the intricacy of his costume. He has a doublet, this jacket that is embroidered to a highly detailed degree with signs and symbols which are extracted from contemporary emblem literature, from contemporary printed emblems. And they all have sort of meanings which can be deciphered, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the meanings in a moment. But if this level of intricacy in a costume is quite rare. In fact, it's not very, you don't really find it in extant Dutch portraits, or in any garments that survive, or indeed in descriptions and inventories from the period. So what makes him so special? Is it the mystery around his lost identity? We don't know exactly who he was. Of course, there's this question a very important question, was he married or not? Was he a bachelor? There's also, of course, his very engaging pose. He has his left arm akimbo, or on his hip, this pose which has become known as the Renaissance elbow, where you see the elbow sort of poking out, breaking through the pictorial space and coming and pushing through into our space. And this is, of course, a device that portraitists use, not just Frans Hals, to make sitters feel closer to us, much like, say, in still life paintings. Sometimes in Dutch still life paintings, you have knives, poking out of a table, trying to sort of break the pictorial space and come towards us. This kind of heightened foreshortening is used in this case with the arm akimbo. He has a very bold demeanor. He's looking down at us, and we're looking at him from below, which is a way in which Frans Hals asserts the sitter's presence. And there's also, of course, the very masterful technique, which has contributed to the painting's fame. I mean, Frans Hals, it's in very good condition as a painting. Also, we see Frans Hals's range of painting from quite fluid, as in this upturned cuff, to much more carefully detailed rendering, as here in the lace here of the cuff. Right. He is wearing the latest French fashions, coming straight from Paris. This kind of doublet with slashing was newly introduced in the 1620s. The flattened collar, again, is new in the 1620s. We saw the stiffly starched collars, which continue to be worn. But if you wanted to be at the height of fashion, you'd be wearing a more flattened collar. And this very beautiful, again, lace cuff. So let me just show you what I mean. The doublet would have been, this is a very rare surviving comparable doublet, French, also from the 1620s. And you can see how the slashes were all across the chest and would have continued on the back. And it is very likely that would have been the same in the case of our Laughing Cavalier. You can see the small buttons that we see on our doublet continue on the center of the back. Very, very beautiful item of clothing. And then the soft falling ruff, composed of multiple layers of linen. There is a comparable example. You can see the contrast of these stiff ruffs. We have a comparable example, and you can see the layers of linen trimmed with bobbin lace. Again, a very costly item, of course, and you wonder how they would have kept these so clean and white at that time. And then the cuff, which is center stage, made up of very sumptuous, costly lace. Everything about the costume is very, very sort of sumptuous and costly. Frans Hals meticulously replicated the geometric design and airy transparency of the lace in paint, and you can see that it is painted on top of finished clothing. And then, of course, he's wearing this sumptuous black silk cloak that he has wrapped around him. The oh yes, and here's the comparable sort of lace. You can see how very closely he copies the geometric design in paint and translates it into paint. Now, I just wanted to take you through some of the various signs and symbols on the doublet, all of which have to do with fortune, strength, love, and virtue. And these are probably things that the sitter is aspiring to or wants to convey. And although many of these signs and symbols are completely, it's like hieroglyphics to us, we can't decipher them. During his own time, they would have been known to learned individuals. So they would have been able to be read, I suppose, much more easily than they are today. So Mercury's cap and caduceus has to do with fortune. Strength is imparted by this obelisk. Symbols of love are insects like this bee here, the sting from Cupid's arrow, or the sting of love, winged arrows, Cupid's attributes, tongues of fire, flaming cornucopia, all having to do with, Cupid's arrows piercing the heart and igniting the fire of love and loss of reason. Lover's knots, and this very beautiful detail of two intertwined wings with two perpendicular arrows that Frans Hals paints beautifully. And we even feel him sort of laying down paint on the canvas. These are all Cupid's attributes that reinforce the love imagery. And then I wanted to come to, so just to sum up, this doublet is quite unique and suggests that he was a very learned person and a very wealthy man at that, which are things that are also suggested through the presence of this very exquisite rapier, gilded rapier, that the sitter holds in the crook of his left elbow. And we see the pommel here, and we see bits of the hilt underneath the sleeve. And I've been very fortunate because we have an in-house curator of arms and armor, Toby Capwell. He's been able to, as you can see, pick apart all of the details and tell me exactly what we see, which is not, it can be easily missed actually, particularly when it comes to the hilt. So we have the tang button, the pommel, rear hilt, large ring guard, small ring guard, and loop guards, all of which Frans Hals tries to sort of position as they would have been in real life. This would have been a very high-end accessory, particularly because it was gilded. And a comparable example we have in our own collection is this English rapier from the early part of the 17th century. You can see the gilded pommel and hilt. And what we've done is a kind of really lovely display in the place where our Laughing Cavalier normally hangs in the Great Gallery. We've instead done something that is rather unique, which is to frame this rapier in a picture frame, and not just any picture frame, but the frame in which our Laughing Cavalier sat for a very long time, probably from when it was acquired, at least from when it was acquired by the fourth Marquis in 1865, until the 1980s when it was reframed in its current frame. So what we have in the Great Gallery is where the Laughing Cavalier is, of course, missing because he's downstairs in our exhibition space at the moment. We have his old frame, and inside of it, we have a very comparable rapier. So hopefully, if you're coming to the Wallace, well, not you, because you know about this already, but if visitors come to the Wallace looking for the Laughing Cavalier and haven't realized he's downstairs in our exhibition space, this will certainly draw their attention. And also it highlights, our arms and armor collection, which is quite a phenomenal collection. And we're so very lucky to be able to put together such a display that other museums might not be able to do, because they don't have both a wonderful paintings collection as well as an arms and armor collection. So, the identity of the Laughing Cavalier. There's so much to say about the Laughing Cavalier. So as I said, I will need to sort of stop myself, and there's a lot more. If you want to know more, there's a lot more in the catalogue. But as far as the identity, although we don't know who he was exactly, and there have been some suggestions, which I'll tell you about in one of the portraits that we'll look at, we can tell that he was probably, given what he's wearing, that it's this very flamboyant, colorful dress, and his age, 26, and that he's facing leftward. So as I said, if he was to have had a pendant, he would have been looking rightward or turned rightward. We can probably assume that he was a bachelor, and that the painting was conceived independently without a pendant, and also that he was incredibly wealthy, incredibly learned, possibly also Flemish, given that a lot of the Flemish emigres to Haarlem were very much wearing this kind of flamboyant dress and seem to have been more interested. And also many of them were also Frans Hals's patrons. The title, The Laughing Cavalier, is something that was given to the picture much later, around 1888, when it was lent by Sir Richard Wallace to the Royal Academy. So it's something that was not part of the patron or the painter's intentions, and but it clearly stuck, and I think it very much contributed to the painting's fame, even though, of course, he's neither laughing nor a cavalier. But it just goes to show you how much a title can have such an impact on a picture, even though it's certainly not, well, not really accurate, to be honest, but very, very catchy. And then just to show you the impact of the picture, it's been reproduced countless times in a variety of ways. Jigsaw puzzles have been made of the Laughing Cavalier. He appears on biscuit tins. I mean, he's been everywhere. But what I found really moving, actually, is that during the first lockdown in May 2020, street artist Lionel Stanhope painted this mural of the Laughing Cavalier in Lewisham in London. And he said that it was because he wanted to make great art accessible to the public while museums were shut due to the pandemic. And I found that really moving. And of course, he could have chosen any artwork, but he chose the Laughing Cavalier. And again, it goes to show that the influence of this picture, how iconic it is, and how it continues to inspire contemporary artists. And I love to see it in a setting where you wouldn't normally expect to see it. And of course, it's probably no longer there because, of course, that wall is being used for murals all the time. So it's not probably been painted over already. And I'm very keen to see, what future iterations of the Laughing Cavalier will come, say, in 50 years' time. So I'll take you through the rest of the portraits now in a kind of whistle-stop tour. This is Isaac Massa. He is very close in date to our Laughing Cavalier. He was painted in 1626, so just 2 years after the Laughing Cavalier. He was a friend of Frans Hals's, and he was painted by Frans Hals several times. This portrait is particularly interesting because it's rather informal. He has his hand on the back of the chair. He's looking out of the picture, and he also has his lips parted as if he's in mid-speech. So these are things that we wouldn't normally expect in a formal independent portrait. And you do get the sense of familiarity, and that there is a kind of connection between patron and sitter, and a collaboration probably in this portrait. And this is the first time that Frans Hals employs this pose with the arm over the back of the chair. And but he likes it very much, and he continues to employ it time and time again. He probably, this is another portrait of Isaac Massa with his new wife at the Rijksmuseum, this wonderful portrait where husband and wife are together in a single composition, which is rare. As I say, most marriage portrait would have been separate on separate panels or canvases. So this again is unusual and might have to do with the collaboration between Frans Hals and Massa, who were, as I say, were friends. But this idea of the arm over the back of the chair, he may have gotten it, Frans Hals may have gotten it from group portraits with sitters around the table, where the sitters in the foreground have to turn in order to be seen in the portrait. And this idea of looking out of the picture is something that Frans Hals would have employed in his genre portraits. And you can see in these rosy cheeks as well, you can see that he's extrapolating techniques that he's using in his genre portraits and bringing them into his more formal individual portraits, commissioned portraits. And I just wanted to say that this opening behind is rather unusual as well. Normally what you'd expect to find there is a shadow or another painting, but we have this opening onto this verdant landscape. And Isaac Massa was a great traveler. He spent many years in Russia. He was a merchant, but he was also ambassador in Moscow for a period. He also traveled widely. He was the first European to write an account of Siberia, and very learned, spoke fluent Russian, and perhaps the opening into the landscape has to do with his travels. It's also thought that it might be by a different hand, by a different artist, which would be a rare occurrence of Frans Hals collaborating with another artist on a single picture, on a picture. This is Peter Fondambrica, and he comes to us from Kenwood House. It's a fantastic portrait, and he is one of the individuals about whom we know most in the exhibition. As I say, he was an admiral in the Dutch East India Company, traveled widely as well. He wears this gold chain around his neck, which is something he received from the VOC, the East India Company, after 17 years of service. It was a very valuable item, and in fact, it was worth about 1,200 guilders, which was 4 times the annual wages of a skilled craftsman. So he's sort of showing off his accomplishments, of course, wearing, again, the latest fashions. His hair is sort of as if he's on one of these ships sailing. You know, he hasn't sort of primed his hair properly to sit for a formal portrait. And this wonderful grin and rosy cheeks, again, things that you might expect to find in Frans Hals's genre portraits. He, as I say, we learned from Maria Holtrop, historian at the Rijksmuseum, that he was involved in the early years of the Dutch slave trade, which would have been something that, you know, one would expect sadly would expect of an individual from this time period. In fact, the Dutch were debating a great deal whether to enter the slave trade or not at the beginning of the 17th century. And of course, in the end, they did. But he is engaging with the slave trade at a moment where the Dutch are unsure whether to partake in it or not. And what we know from his own accounts, from his own journals, is that he had 2 children by his own slaves, whom he subsequently freed, 2 women from India. He also had a 3rd child by a free Turkish woman. And then he writes about how when he's in Cape Verde around 1610, so about 20 years prior to this portrait, in this portrait, he's about 48. So this would have been when he was in his 20s. He went to Cape Verde, he writes in his journal, off the western coast of Africa. And he talks about how he's offered children for money. And in one case, he buys a little girl of 10 years old for 61 kilos of rice. And he writes about how he's surprised at how the mother hands him over the child and is not moved very much, and how after that more people offer him their children. So these are actually really moving stories, but that's part of the reality of the time, and we're able to tell these stories thankfully now about these individuals, which would have been part of that time, and we need to be telling these stories going forward, I think. This portrait from the Rijksmuseum is wonderful because I think the first thing that strikes me about it is the fluidity of the way that Frans Hals paints it, the quick brush strokes, the way it's almost impressionistic, particularly in the face, we really get a sense that he is being captured in a fleeting moment. We see that Frans Hals really likes the pose with the arm over the back of the chair, and he re-employs it time and time again. And again, it gives the portrait a sense of informality, which is very different from the pendant portrait of the man's wife. You can see that she's much more formally posed. She has her arms lowered. She's wearing this very stiff, stiffly starched collar, and she's actually much more finely painted in the sense that you don't get this very quick impressionistic brushstroke as we do over his face. So I think there really was, it is about convention, adhering to convention, and how a woman is meant to be portrayed at that time. And in this case, I think it does, there was an expectation that women were to be portrayed in a more sober way. Nicholas van Voorhout is absolutely wonderful. He comes to us from the Metropolitan Museum, and he was a brewer. He was from a family of brewers. His parents had a brewery in Haarlem called the Swan's Neck, and he inherited it. He was also a collector. He had about 56 paintings in his own collection when he dies. And you can see that he certainly has sampled his own product. He's wearing the most sumptuous silk doublet. He hangs close to our Laughing Cavalier in the exhibition because he's one of the few portraits in which he has his left arm akimbo rather than his right arm akimbo. As we saw, he's also facing away from a possible pendant, so it's likely that he was also conceived in this case as an independent work. We see that, you know, men are slowly starting the fashion for longer and longer hair, and as we move through the century, we'll see that the hair gets longer and longer, collars get flatter, and of course Frans Hals able to paint this doublet, the silk doublet, really makes us feel the material with these dashing strokes of paint, of unblended paint, is quite extraordinary. And here you see a close-up of that. You really feel him laying down the paint on canvas. And overall, you know, relatively economical technique in that we see bits of the ground layer peeping through. But so what I'm trying to say is with relatively little, he achieves a great deal. And then we have a group of 3/4 length portraits of men, calling them our men in black. They're more soberly dressed, I suppose, because of the color of their garments, but equally exquisite. So this is a portrait from the Royal Collection from 1630. And although he's wearing black, he's the most sumptuous black. He has this cloak that is wrapped around him, and he rests his left arm and elbow in it. He's relatively soberly dressed, perhaps because he was, you know, because of his more conservative leanings. Perhaps he was part of the Council of Haarlem, had sort of more formal position within the city. But a clue to his wealth, I suppose, is his only accessory, which are these leather gloves, which would have been rather costly at the time. They're made of kid, and they are a way in which he is showing off his status and wealth. But you see, he's not adhering to the other general trends of flatter collars. He's still wearing that stiffly starched, beautifully rendered by Frans Hals white collar, and he's not letting his hair grow longer as others are doing. And he was a textile merchant in the city of Haarlem, very wealthy, and you can see that in this most wonderful, luxurious black velvet costume that he's wearing with these beautiful rosettes along the waist. We can see that the doublets are getting a bit longer. He also is in this case carrying this wide-brimmed black hat, which was a symbol of male authority at the time. Beautiful white flat collar. You can see as well his hair getting a bit longer. There has been suggestion that he might be the same sitter as our Laughing Cavalier, painted 10 years apart. This remains a question, I suppose. He was painted in 1624, and he is 36 years old when Frans Hals painted him. And we made sure to hang him in a way where he and the Laughing Cavalier can be seen together, so that visitors can engage with this possible comparison. Francois Wouters, this is very interesting. This is a portrait from Edinburgh, and for a very long time he was a Dutch gentleman, and only recently a very keen-eyed visitor to the National Galleries of Scotland identified him as Francois Wouters, who actually appears in other group portraits by Frans Hals. And the curator was delighted to be able to change his title to his name, and now we know a great deal more about him. He was a brewer, but also a burgomaster in the city of Haarlem. And you can see he's relatively conservative in his dress, sober pose, and then you have this amazing sort of casual detail where you have this beautifully, quickly painted leather glove, and then you have a hint of the wrist showing through. So in this way, you know, what is a rather formal portrait is this details which sort of give it a bit of informality. And he was painted on the occasion of his second marriage to Susanna Bailey, and she's also in Edinburgh. And you can see they are quite wealthy. She's wearing the most high-end accessories at the time, beautiful, sumptuous jewelry, this fan and handkerchief. All of these were high-end accessories at the time, and status symbols really in portraits. This is a wonderful portrait from the Metropolitan Museum, where we don't know the identity of the sitter, but we can tell that he is again also wearing the latest fashions. The doublets are getting shorter, rather monochromatic, aside from a few accents of color in these tabliers galants, as they were known, these little ribbons that were hanging from his shirt down here. And you can see, as I was saying, the hair is getting longer, to the extent that by 1645, when these two wonderful portraits were painted, you can see their hair has gotten even longer, that there was something known as the dispute of the locks, where church fathers really they were not pleased that men were letting their hair grow, took issue with. I was trying to say that men were letting their hair grow so long, and considered this to be rather inappropriate, and encouraged men to take scissors to their locks. And clearly these two young gentlemen did not take all of this into account and continued to wear their hair long. These two portraits are among my favorites in the exhibition. They are both painted in 1645. Both are 22 years old at that time, and both were bachelors. They're wearing the most extravagant, sort of flamboyant clothes. William Coymens was from a banking family, and Frans Hals painted a number of members of that family. And Jasper Schade was an aristocrat. He was from a patrician family in Utrecht. And it's wonderful because it shows us that Frans Hals' fame, you know, went beyond the city of Haarlem alone, and that very prominent individuals sought his portraiture from across the Dutch Republic. So William Coymens, you can see he's reusing this pose with the arm over the back of the chair. You can see this most wonderful hat with a pom-pom. He has this beautiful flat collar, and what I absolutely love is these 3 or 4 dashes of black paint, very quickly painted, where Frans Hals is indicating shadow. Beautiful white shirt spilling out through this single slash of the doublet. You can see that the shirts have now tighter cuffs around the wrist, very elegant, in which the hand sort of just hangs over the back of the chair. The most exquisite pose, I think. And we're very fortunate to have this portrait from the National Gallery in Washington, of Art in Washington. And equally, we're very grateful to the National Gallery in Prague for lending us this exquisite portrait of Jasper Schade, who was notorious for his high bills at the tailors. He was into fashion. He loved clothing, and in fact, we know that in the year that the painting was painted in 1645, he spent an exorbitant amount of 300 francs for a single item of clothing in Paris, which would have been very much to spend at that time. And so he's absolutely wonderful. And you can see this zigzag of strokes that Frans Hals uses to create that Renaissance elbow is absolutely extraordinary. And we're really starting to feel why he was so much appreciated by Impressionists and post-Impressionists. But this portrait, I think, conveys that the most. The latest portrait in the exhibition from the 1660s, when Frans Hals was in his 80s, you can see the great departure from that early portrait from the barber to where we've come here from this, in this portrait from the Fitzwilliam, where you have these broad brush strokes of unblended paint, particularly on the face, where he's just laying down color, and then we're meant to blend it all before the painting in our eye, in our mind. He's the only one wearing his cloak, and we really feel Frans Hals laying down the strokes of paint to create this wonderful cloak. And of course, the wide hat. There was a mania for hats in the 1660s, and they were getting wider and wider, to the extent that an 18th century owner of the portrait must have disliked it and had it painted out. He had the hat painted out. And then in 1949, when the portrait was being cleaned at the Fitzwilliam Museum, they discovered that actually there was a hat underneath, and the hat was restored and it was brought back. So it just gives you a sense of how these portraits have a life and how they've been transformed throughout their history. So I think he makes a very wonderful ending, and I hope you can see the trajectory that we've taken and what context we've situated our Laughing Cavalier in around these portraits. We've been very pleased with the reviews that we've received, and we hope that visitors are equally having a wonderful experience in the exhibition. We also have a lot of content that relates to the exhibition on our website that you may have come across when you registered for this talk. We also have a specific video on our Laughing Cavalier. We have a trail that takes you around the collection. If you just go to Wallace Collection, Meet the Expert. And then, of course, we have a lot of on offer in our shop. Once you also online, if you aren't able to visit, you can also go to the Wallace Collection shop online and get your very own Laughing Cavalier mask, in case you were missing that. And different types of Laughing Cavalier masks, in fact. And then just wanted to say, going from murals to jigsaw puzzles to biscuit tins, I was very happy to see our Laughing Cavalier on the London Tube the other day. And as I say, I'm very curious to see the places to which he'll travel in the future. So thank you very much for listening. And I do hope you have a chance to see the exhibition. And if you don't, thank you so much for visiting us and listening today. And I'm happy to take a few questions.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Lelia. That was a real sort of whirlwind tour of our exhibition. We have had a few questions in, so I'll just rush through those quickly now. So I'll start on YouTube. We had a question from Marion, who's asked, or rather they said, when I visited the exhibition, I was struck by the amount of very loose brushwork, which we discussed quite extensively this afternoon. On what are presumably finished portraits. Was this more common than was understood, or was this sort of specific to Hals?
I would say it's uncommon. Actually, there was a fashion for it's a very good question. There was a fashion for very finely painted portraits where the brushstrokes were invisible, if you will, where the touch of the artist was not present. And Frans Hals, I think, stands out. I mean, probably late Rembrandt is also this idea of the rough manner. It's something you also see in late Rembrandt. And of course, Frans Hals in a different way. But I wouldn't say it was the dominant style was one where you would have these much finely painted portraits, where there was an absence of the artist's touch by making their brushwork invisible, if you will. Of course, it was very visible I think you know what I'm trying to say. So in a way, I would say it was rather unique.
Fantastic, thank you. But had another question, this time over Zoom. Louise has asked, many of Hals' subjects are grinning or smiling, as opposed to Rembrandt's more melancholic portraits. Was this a novel form of portrait making? And what does it tell us about the artist?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think, as I say, I think Frans Hals is borrowing or extracting tactics from his genre portraits, in which scenes of everyday life, in which he would have had figures smiling or with rosy cheeks. And he's extrapolating those types of tactics and bringing them into his more formal portraits as a way to enliven them and really bring them to life. And again, it's not common, and it makes him stand out among Dutch portraitists of that time. I don't know if we can go so far as to make judgments about what it tells us about him specifically, but what it does is it does enliven his portraits in a way that I think makes them stand out within Dutch portraiture more generally.
Certainly. A few more questions now. I'm just going to run through as we've got a few more coming in. John on Zoom again has asked, what is the significance of the piece of holly on the ground in two of the portraits? I think this might be in someone's hand as well.
Yes, so that is something I found to mean friendship and constancy is the significance of holly, which is a bit prickly, so I don't know about that, but that's what the literature tells us.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll take another question from YouTube now, as we've got a few minutes left. We have a question here from Joanna, who said, what was usually the purpose of painting these portraits? Were they for status reasons, or is it something else?
Yeah, good question. I mean, oftentimes, particularly the ones that were painted together with a man and a woman on the occasion of marriage. For example, as I said, in this case, Francois Wouters, this was on the occasion probably of their marriage. This was on the occasion of his second marriage to this woman, Susanna Bailey. So whether it was, and to be presumably to be exhibited within the home, within their own home, we don't always have inventories where we know where the portraits would have hung. So we don't. But in the case of Jasper Schade, it's a very rare case where we know where the portrait hung. So it's the only case, actually. So this portrait would have hung in his country house. So it was painted for him. And it hung above the doorway to the salon. So sort of in the main entry of this very sumptuous country house, above the door to the salon. So, and it hung there for about 200 years, even after his own family no longer lived in the house. And there was a whole legend about how if the portrait's taken down, the whole house would collapse. So nobody dared to move the portrait from this location. And then finally, when Frans Hals comes back into fashion in the late 19th century, and there's quite a bit of money to be made from selling his portrait, this portrait was finally sold. But a copy was put in his place, just in case. And then, the house still stands today. So we don't know exactly the original location of many of these portraits. We can assume that they were made for domestic interiors and for the sitter's own homes, oftentimes, but not always.
Well, that's great. Thank you. It's such a story about. I hope the house is still all right today.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about running out of time for questions today, but thank you to everybody who's sent in questions on Zoom and on YouTube. It's always fantastic to have those conversations and perhaps think about our paintings or our exhibition in a slightly different way. So thank you for getting those in. And of course, thank you to all of our audience for joining today. And a huge thank you to Lelia for today's talk. It's always fantastic to get to sit in on these. Just to say finally, of course, if you enjoyed today's talk, Lelia's Expert's Choice video looking at the Laughing Cavalier is available via our YouTube channel. You can find the link just below. And if you'd like to join us next month for our next Meet the Expert talk, our head of curatorial, Yoroko Jackal, will be taking a look at our Fragonard project. So again, the link is just at the bottom of our YouTube description there. And before I forget, today we are, of course, open again. The Wallace collection is free to enter, and there's no need to book. You can just turn up and have a look around our permanent collection. And if you'd like to see the exhibition, as well. We hope you do. The tickets are available to purchase from the website, from our website, or on site as well. So we hope to see you in the coming weeks, and have a good afternoon.